rhythm was humming harder as the ceiling flew away. When we called out for another drink, the waiter brought a tray, and so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, her face at first just ghostly turned a whiter shade of pale. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases, and then attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. So this past weekend was a pretty big one as far as new releases. Not much to speak of in the way of major tentpoles or whatever, but as we're winding down for the year, we're definitely seeing an uptick in significant art house and independent releases. That last leg of the race for a lot of independent, foreign, and boutique film distributors to get in the last shots at the upcoming award seasons and, of course, the critics' top 10 lists. I had a really hard choice to make this week. Was I going to make my way to the IFC Center this Thursday to catch the earliest previews of Paul Schrader's latest movie, O Canada, starring Richard Gere, or the Angelica Film Center, who themselves was hosting The End, which is an offbeat-looking genre musical that is mainly significant for being the feature fiction film debut by writer-director Joshua Oppenheimer. He previously rose to international fame through his documentaries, those being The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. Meanwhile, the next day, Film at Lincoln Center was screening British filmmaker Mike Leigh's latest drama, Hard Truths. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There were also several smaller international and indie films this past weekend that piqued my interest, including the Canadian-Kenyan co-production The Wall Street Boy and a Brazilian feminist sports drama called Power Alley, both of which started at Cinema Village this past weekend. I was also particularly interested in another American sports drama, The Day of the Fight, as well as a cheeky-looking neo-noir called Lake George, and finally this very creepy-seeming Danish psychological horror/true crime flick called The Girl with the Needle. But for everything this past weekend had to offer in terms of the major metropolitan epicenters, really getting everything a well-honed cineast could have wanted in terms of just the first course of what promises to be a year-end smorgasbord of diverse and challenging movies, I decided I was going to stick a little closer to home to see what had only about a week ahead of its release become one of my most anticipated movies of the year. That being The Order, itself an American true crime thriller, this one based on the case of the eponymous Order, a Washington state-based neo-Nazi terrorist group that, under the leadership of the then 30-year-old Robert J. Matthews, perpetrated a series of bombings, bank and armored truck robberies, as well as the murder of radio talk show host Alan Berg between the autumn of 1983 and the winter of 1984. This film is based on the non-fiction book The Silent Brotherhood by authors Kevin Flynn and Gary Gerhardt, and stars Nicholas Hoult as Bob Matthews as well as Jude Law as FBI agent Terry Husk, who, following his experiences investigating both the Italian-American Mafia and the Ku Klux Klan, relocates to a small FBI field office in Idaho where, along with a local police officer named Jamie, played by Ty Sheridan, begins piecing together the pattern in the series of robberies and bombings that have been occurring all over the northwest of the United States, and realizing these are not disparate incidents or organized crime, but part of a larger identitarian plot. And I was fairly excited to see this ever since I first started seeing the trailers for it about a month ago, but my interest especially was inflamed when I finally realized who the director of The Order was, none other than the Australian auteur Justin Kurzel. And if you don't know that name, you really ought to, because ever since bursting onto the international film scene in 2011, Kurzel has continued to be among one of the most exciting and compelling directors in world cinema, with a pattern of crafting really quite exceptional, visually sensual, but also quite dour and psychologically driven films that all have a tendency towards this poetic obsession with the intersections of class, constructs of masculinity, and crimes of extreme violence. Starting off with his debut, Snowtown, known internationally as the Snowtown Murders, which is itself a true crime drama about a series of murders perpetrated in and around a poor suburb of Adelaide in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. That was followed by a very dreamy and macabre adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth starring Michael Fassbender that came out in 2015, stumbling a bit in 2016 with a foray into contemporary Hollywood when Kurzel ended up directing a very poorly critically received and financially disappointing adaptation of the Ubisoft game Assassin's Creed, only for him to really return to form in 2019 with the absolutely amazing True History of the Kelly Gang, another true crime flick, that one about the famous 19th century bushranger and outlaw Ned Kelly. Easily one of my favorite films of 2019 and arguably one of the best films of that decade. Then followed most recently by Nitram, another true crime film written by Kurzel's frequent collaborator Sean Grant, with whom he had previously created Snowtown and the Kelly Gang, this film being an impressionistic depiction of the events leading up to the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, the mass shooting in which 35 people were killed and 24 were wounded by the gunman Martin Bryant. Clearly exemplary in Kurzel's oeuvre is, again, a preoccupation with real-life crimes that, at a dramatic level, serve as a basis for these hypnotic explorations of the very extremes of violence, especially extremely violent acts perpetrated by individual or groups of young men coming into the thrall of a very charismatic, though decidedly unwell individual who, either due to systemic issues of poverty or lack of resources, or simply due to a culture of nihilism and alienation and apathy, turn to crime not merely for cynical reasons, but clearly for glorious reasons, for reasons of trying to affirm their own power and their own identities. You see it in Snowtown, you see it in True History of the Kelly Gang, you see it in a more isolated version with Nitram, and you definitely see it in The Order, where you see Kurzel finally stretching beyond the hyperbolic confines of Australian true crime history and that nation's own toxic extremes of masculine culture, and into a different, though decidedly not dissimilar, national and cultural context. Now, Kurzel is not reuniting with Grant for this film. The screenplay for The Order is adapted by Zach Balin, and that alone is definitely enough to make The Order stand out immediately in terms of Kurzel's ongoing filmography, for both interesting and underwhelming reasons. The main thing about Kurzel's past collaborations with Grant is that, as a screenwriter, though Grant is very detail-oriented, his style of writing has really been more to provide a kind of lucid framework for Kurzel to make these true crime films that are not, in and of themselves, particularly interested in the visceral thrills of true crime as a genre. His films tend to suggest far more of an interest in using these extreme violent episodes in order to explore the psychology of isolated individuals and to ask questions about what this can speak to about a kind of endemic, almost genetic-seeming violence that permeates every facet of a time and a culture and a system. And though with Nitram you already saw Grant and Kurzel moving towards a more conventionally directed kind of true crime drama, in his collaboration with Balin, whose most notable credits would be his own contributions to biopics directed by Ronaldo Marcus Green, like the Academy Award-nominated King Richard, as well as this year's Bob Marley One Love. What you're getting here with The Order, especially if you're as big a booster of Kurzel's films as I have been, is something that, on the page at least, is far more conventional and even rudimentary as far as true crime stories go. Here are the major incidents. here is the dramatically simplified setup between the cops and the criminals. Here is the procedure that brought the long hand of the law bearing down. Not that Balin isn't up for the job. As far as true crime thrillers go, The Order is a very tightly written project with a very astute sense of the rhythm that even just a good true crime thriller needs to have, with the violent crime scenes almost being like the pounding crescendos to these long trials of more ambient procedural stretches. But there's certainly an extent to which, even for the thrilling true crime topic it chooses to dramatize, The Order, again on the page at least, can come off as quite cliche, right down to Jude Law himself taking on a rather thanklessly cliche job as FBI agent Terry Husk, basically portraying another in a long line of intelligent but brutishly vulgar law enforcers who we catch up to in media res as they are becoming estranged from their wives and family, are half-heartedly making a go at a more quiet life only to be sucked back into the calling of protecting society at large from the worst of the worst, even right down to the implication that Husk is an alcoholic who sometimes needs to chip cocaine to give him just the right edge he needs to walk along this razor. I will say this, even in terms of how Kurzel approaches directing Balin's script, The Order feels so much like a Michael Mann movie. That's really what it comes down to. And given its subject, there is a little bit of discourse here that I don't really have time to get into, which is that just like Michael Mann's Heat, there is this almost quasi-romantic relationship between the criminals and the people pursuing them. In this case, Bob Matthews as the criminal and Jude Law's character. But it's definitely made a whole lot weirder due to the subject matter of these guys not just being, like bank robbers, but literally like white supremacist terrorists who are trying to overthrow the government and kill lots of people. There's definitely enough to like about The Order to put it just over the edge of bog standard true crime slop into being at least a marginally great example of the genre, but frankly, all of that is coming down to Kurzel's direction itself. Through his specific attunement to exactly this kind of story that is fundamentally about masculine identity and violence. That is not simply archetypes and cliches for him, but as an Australian artist who has spent the better part of 15 years especially obsessing over his own country's most legendary figures and touchstones of crime and violence, even when he's now approaching something so granular as the United States' own history of right-wing extremism and white supremacist and white separatist terror and cults, he's not approaching it through the veil of simply what's on the page, not through the dragnet sense of just the facts, ma'am, not just the visceral content that powers so much of the true crime fiction and its fandom. Rather, Kurzel's penchant, even as he mounts this much more textually rudimentary true crime project, is precisely his ability through visual storytelling, through this troublingly sensual imagery that stands in counterpoint to the often quite gallows and harrowing content he depicts, almost as if he is trying to draw us into the very psychic, and again, in relation to Michael Mann, this almost romantic sensualist realm of these characters, to see the world through their eyes, no matter how alienating it is. Kurzel's penchant is his very ability to eschew content and to find highly suggestive allegory, to make sure that these stochastic outbursts of violence move beyond the borders of their explicitness and their extremity and become things that we can connect to far more banal aspects of everyday culture and life. And it turns out there's a lot of similarities between the Australian and American context, whether we're talking about a history of colonization and genocide as the predicate for these grand myths of westward expansion made on the backs of strident individuals and yeoman farmers and bushrangers, all of them white. The centrality and fetishization of firearms as a part of that mythology, the ways in which outlaws and vigilantes can often find themselves, if not becoming becoming national icons, as in the case of Ned Kelly, can, in the case of the Snowtown murders, for instance, in a more anecdotal case, really draw in alienated and deprived individuals, charismatically propping themselves up as inspiring real-life figures of this kind of strong, defiant, always coded white masculinity that takes power back into its own hands, that at once sets itself apart from dominant society, but nonetheless frames itself as taking down the fire of Olympus, basically, of giving back to these men the mythopoeic power that they feel they have lost or have been deprived of since their birth. Of course, where the Order is set apart in terms of that exploration of themes and real-life men trying to be archetypes and make themselves into modern myths, there's a great scene where Bob Matthews is literally reading the white supremacist novel, The Turner Diaries, to his son, and you can tell just how much of Bob Matthews' psychology is not influenced by real life. It is literally influenced by this work of utopian, idealistic fiction. This is what he's pinning so much of his ideals and his ideology to himself no longer really being human, to ascending to this level of an archetypal manhood that just has no basis in reality. So what sets the story of the Order and Bob Matthews apart is something that Kurzel at least hasn't explicitly explored yet, which is the specific white identitarian tenor of a lot of this kind of ideology and the incredible violence it leads to. So then what Kurzel brings to this project, which isn't exactly on the page, is his ability to not just depict the extremes of Bob Matthews and this cult of personality and the white supremacist circles that he runs in, but to really try to draw you into the nightmarish implications of his psychic universe, of these small, working class, now increasingly anti-government and separatist white enclaves, many of whom are not actually from the Northwest, but have moved there as a way of escaping what was, at the time, both an increasingly desegregating, but also otherwise extremely economically and socially unstable world. Quite frankly, the 80s were not a really fun time for most people. There are a lot of people who, quite frankly, still haven't recovered from the trauma of the 80s. Like, they still seem to think that it's still the 80s now. Reuniting with cinematographer Adam Arkapaw, who Kurzel also worked with on Snowtown and Macbeth, where the Order really finds its purchase to craft not just exploitative thrills and suspense out of true crime content, but to really set you into a suffocating, oppressive atmosphere of not just the physical place, not just the cultural place, but the psychic place, even at the outset of the story, where Agent Husk walks into a random convenience store and sees a flyer hanging up on full display recruiting for the white supremacist cult of which Matthews' group is an offshoot. We perceive a world in which there is this fine line between the apparent ideological and cultural fringes of what Matthews is doing, but then the overall oppressive whiteness of the entire Northwestern community around them, where Matthews and the Order are able to move and coordinate with so much apparent competence and freedom, where they prey upon fears of the outside and the other, to a community that, by and large, doesn't actually ever interact with the people they apparently fear very much. What the Order makes abundantly clear is that even as we get to hear the various grievances of some of the members of the Order and the white supremacist church that they are an offshoot of, especially the theme of allegedly losing one's job to black people or immigrants, or losing a family member to the skyrocketing rates of violent crime that swept all over the United States between the late 60s and the late 90s. And it should be said that both Balin and Kurzel's focus tends to be on the ritual and elaborative performance of these white supremacist cults, not in any actual tangibility of its justifications outside of a general sense of a lot of these folks seeming to be economically deprived and really desperately seeking someone to blame for it, but also just in general somewhere to belong. Considering the results of the last election, where so much of a plurality of the Latino vote went to the fascist Donald Trump, it is very interesting that there is a major plot point in this film that involves a Latino guy pretending to be Spanish just because he's so desperate to join the cool Nazi gang. What the film makes abundantly clear is that the prime mover of this cult and this violence is not any outside forces acting upon them. It is simply the oppressive natural process of this isolated community of white working people, steeped in an ideology and culture of strident individualism and opposition to authority that is constantly feeding in on itself and constantly making itself more isolated and more extreme without actually a lot of external pressure that isn't largely imagined. And the visual conveyance of this by Kurzel and Arkapaw is really nothing short of extraordinary, simply in terms of how much whiteness becomes an essential, all-consuming, oppressive part of the visual look of the Order. Plenty of thrillers and genre films go for that kind of desaturated, frigid, ghostly, pallid white to try to cheaply situate you in an atmosphere of dread. But what puts Kurzel and Arkapa's work here so subtly a cut above the rest is how frequently, even on a fairly clear-skied autumn day, they will seem to actually deliberately overexpose the image so that the world is just bathed in this pallid but blinding light, so that sometimes shots with the sky framed in the background will almost be deliriously blinding in terms of how much of the negative space in the frame is just blasted out by this disorienting whiteness. You especially see this in a very exciting shootout scene between the Order and Agent Husk, which is also very, very much reminiscent of Heat, where the oppressive, blasted out whiteness of the world is doing just as much work to engender this sense of constant, all-consuming threat and insanity and ever-escalating violence and hatred as the shooting of the guns themselves. I honestly first noticed Kurzel and Arkapa's choice of this in a scene where Agent Husk and Officer Jamie, Ty Sheridan's character, they discover the body of a man the Order has murdered, buried in the woods, and though there is green foliage all around them, though there are plenty of places where the sun is coming through the trees and bouncing highlights off the leaves, even the highlights on the green leaves seem to have been color corrected in post so that even the very natural world itself never escapes the all-permeating cast of this deathly white that embodies everything. Even in this green foliage, you're not seeing the highlights off these leaves in terms of a gradient from green to white. There's just this whiteness that is endemic and baked into every aspect of the image. What puts the Order a cut above, even in terms of movies about white supremacists, is that it is not simply a story about the anecdotal, fringe-coded acts of violence. It is a movie about violence, about the psychic veil of violence endemic to culture and values that encapsulates not just the fringes of this society, but also symbolically at least, even implicates the archetype of Agent Husk himself. There is this very good scene where Bob Matthews is stalking and gets the bead on Husk as the latter is hunting in the woods. And the thing about this scene is that while Husk has his sights trained on a big elk and Matthews has his sights trained on Husk, as Husk is realizing he can't shoot the elk, Matthews is also realizing he can't shoot Husk. Because even though he and Husk are both on opposite sides of the law, just as to Matthews they are on opposite sides of this great race war against the Zog machine that took America away from Christian whites, even though Matthews sees Husk as a race traitor, when he is seeing Husk in that moment, you see Matthew's own mind at work, his own kaleidoscope of fringe values, bringing Husk himself into relief as someone he admires, as someone he identifies with within the prism of his supposedly fringe ideology, as this great archetype of the strong yeoman white man in himself. There is a version of the world in which that same narrative, at least at a baseline, at an ideological baseline, leads to him becoming like a cop or a soldier or even just a football player. And that's the secret sauce that Kurzel has as a filmmaker. He takes what in another filmmaker's hands would just be superficial content and renders it into something far more powerfully suggestive, something that doesn't just show us uncomfortable things to try to titillate and excite us, but brings us ourselves too close for comfort to the larger implications of these discrete, seemingly isolated events in the world that we are living in and occupy with crazy psychos like this. I'm gonna give The Order a very enthusiastic 3.5 out of 5, not really close to being Kurzel's best work to date or even necessarily one of his better works, but definitely more evidence of his talents as a director, even when working with fodder that is, again, not the sort of thing that suggests much more than what is on the page, but The Order is far more than just an embellished telling of mere events. It is a darkly romantic parable about who we are as Americans, about our values, about how we define and narrativize our identities and our ideas of heroism and utopia, and how these things, even if we don't perceive it, are often in direct continuity with ideas that we might say are fringe in some cases, but are also eerily running so parallel in terms of their conspiratorialness and their paranoia and their obsession with violence and their ability to support a dominant ideology of white supremacy, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly. Again, this is not just a movie about these crazy white people and the good multicultural coalition of the FBI that tries to stop them. This is a movie about going into a world of endemic, sickly, deathly, pallid whiteness and the feeling like there's just no escape from it. It's a nightmare movie. This is not a feel-good story of the law triumphing over clear, degenerative evil. This is, in many ways, a movie about an only Pyrrhic victory in a war that is always going to be lost, because the people fighting at the forefront of the war are themselves strangely heroes and admired by the very people they're trying to stop and envied by the very people that are fighting against them and that they're fighting with. That's kind of what makes The Order so special. I think it's very exceptional in terms of illustrating visually and subtly why whiteness and masculinity become such a volatile mixture and why that's so pertinent to the present political moment. With that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.